From 1914 to 1918, newspapers worldwide were reporting stories about World War I, also called the Great War. There was daily news from the trenches, as well as the war effort on the home front. Some stories were heartbreaking, particularly beside the list of injuries and loss of life reported in long columns. Amongst the sadness were articles that must have seemed odd in those desperate times, which are also quaintly full of hope that the Great War would end all wars and bring about positive changes for all countries involved. Here are some of those little-known odd aspects of the war. Metal armour. The newspapers were keen to keep their readers up to date with the attire worn by the soldiers in the trenches, and some of the garments devised by the militaries were almost beyond ridiculous. An example was the paper vest, which had apparently been designed to keep the British soldiers warm in Belgian trenches. The soldiers were issued with vests created from a sheet of paper, seemingly neither warm nor lasting very long in the damp and chilly mud of the trenches. At the opposite extreme was an outfit like metal armour worn by the French lookouts in the trenches. This armour had been hastily produced and almost resembled medieval attire, only much cruder. While the lookouts donned the armour as protection from sharpshooters, their own visibility and mobility were severely restricted in these costumes. Other strange attire was this audio-visual apparatus created by the Germans. The equipment was designed to help pinpoint enemy positions by enhancing the boom and flash of enemy artillery. Red-headed soldiers. Appeals for soldier husbands became popular during World War I. They were a morale boost for the men and a means by which young women could find themselves a patriotic husband. However, some of the appeals for husbands were distinctly questionable. In one strange request published in 1915, 3 young Maori women from New Zealand had very specific requirements in their quests for soldier husbands. Firstly, the soldiers must be American. They also needed to have red hair and always be dressed in their uniforms with pretty bright yellow stripes down each side of the pants. Their jacket had to have a dash or two of the yellow adorning the sleeves. The women also stipulated that they would not accept men who were old or had whiskers. The applicants who satisfied these visual requirements would be swept away to marry them in their island homes, as the women appeared to have no intention of moving to the US. New recruits. A newspaper article in 1915 reported that England had discovered that many men were not interested in signing up for king and country. However, it stated as soon as a young woman or two queried a man as to why they were not in the trenches, the very same man would often give in and enlist in the forces. It was preferable to present at the enlistment station rather than be judged a coward by females. The British government openly confessed to recruiting young women for what it saw as a greater cause, sending them out into the streets holding banners that urged men to enlist. Those men who had so far refused to sign up were even personally targeted by the women recruiters, who would cajole them into enlisting for war service and in some cases were handed white feathers for cowardice. Humour was also used to entice new recruits. Some propaganda ads promised young men a summer trip to Berlin, while another ominous recruiting spiel promoted the war as if it were a marvellous hunting expedition. The country is arranging a trip to Germany for a few sportsmen, all expenses and hotel fare paid, good shooting and hunting, rifles and ammunition supplied free, cheap trips up the Rhine. Apply at once as only a limited number, 1 million, is required. Wine bottles. Soldiers from all involved countries suffered hardship during the war. Food was inadequate and even proper equipment was not easily obtained. The men were young, frightened and usually far from home, often perishing by the scores in harsh battles. Often there was no one around to bury the remains as they should have been. Sometimes efforts were made to undertake respectful farewells for casualties. In 1915, an American newspaper published a poignant image of makeshift graves of some fallen German soldiers. Their comrades had been able to spend time burying the men in separate plots and had placed wooden crosses painted white over each spot to mark the individual soldier who lays there. Without equipment to mark off the boundaries of each grave, the men used the nearest available items, empty wine bottles. Each wine bottle was partly buried, mouth down, in the earth to indicate where each soldier rested, to avoid disturbance if others needed to be buried in the same patch of ground. The insults. There were many occasions during the Great War when the trenches of opposing forces were quite close together. An account of one such incident was given in 1915 when a Belgian infantryman corresponded with a London newspaper to relate some rather lively banter between groups of Belgian and German soldiers. He told how the trenches were a mere 45 metres or 150 feet apart, and that the men stationed there would throw insults at each other throughout the day and night. The quarrels and abusive rhetoric became so disruptive and distracting that the Belgian colonel finally forbade his men from engaging in the war of words with the German enemies. As the Belgian man said, it was a pity too, as it was a great pleasure to tell one's enemy one's contempt and hate. Canadian wives. It was usual for women to remain at home when the husbands and sons left to fight the war, with the exception of being a large number of Canadian wives. These courageous women wanted to provide moral support for their loved ones, and many sold off all their possessions in Canada so that they could set sail for London. According to a report in 1916, the devotion was creating a problematic situation for England because many of the Canadian women ended up being stranded in their country. In one case, a woman who had left Quebec to be close to her husband in England found on reaching London that her husband had been redirected to France a mere 2 hours before her arrival. Soon after this, her husband was registered as missing, and the woman had no way to search for him or return to her home country. In another incident, a woman sold everything she owned to finance a trip from Montreal to London to be at her wounded husband's side. She remained there, caring for him in a Canadian military hospital until he was honourably discharged because of the severity of his injuries. The Canadian government then paid for the man's return journey to Canada, but his wife, with no remaining resources, was left behind, stranded and alone. Even if a woman had the financial means to sail back to Canada, there were often other obstacles preventing her. For example, the courts of London are often preoccupied with working on passport cases. Canadian women who needed to return home were unable to prove that they were from Canada and had difficulties obtaining passport papers to leave the country. Gascon. In the French trenches, there was a station which was known as the Gascon. A sentry was on guard beside the gong, and his duty was to be on the alert for German gas attack. At the first inkling of the gassy smoke, the soldier would ring the gong, signalling the other soldier to quickly don their gas masks. The use of gas in combat was not the only thing contaminating the air in the trenches. The men also had to deal with the noxious fumes coming from artillery shells. Instead of having to put on the cumbersome gas masks amid shell attacks, British soldiers would wet handkerchiefs and secure them to cover their mouths and noses to protect them from the fumes. Gas schools. It's not widely known that young men had to prove both their courage and their physical endurance before they were sent into the trenches of war. A photograph taken in 1917 showed a young man who was wearing a gas mask and standing next to a door labelled with the symbol for lethal poison. This was the entrance to what was known as the gas school or gas house. Each new recruit had to venture into the toxic building to demonstrate that he could withstand the onslaught of a gas attack. If one of the men indicated that he could not tolerate being enclosed in the poison house, he was allocated a job other than armed combat within the military. The marriages. With so many young soldiers being wounded on the battlefield, it was not long before someone came up with the idea of matchmaking these injured fellows with suitable prospective wives. In 1915, the Reverend Ernest Houghton, the rector of Bristol, established a league for single women who were willing to, what he called, sacrifice their happiness by marrying a disabled soldier. Reverend Houghton arranged the marriages by deciding what kind of wife was most appropriate for each soldier who applied for help finding a lifelong caregiver. His reasoning went like this. A soldier who has been crippled so that he is unable to walk requires a strong woman who can carry him or push him around in a wheelchair. A soldier whose mental health has been ruined by asphyxiating gas would become cheered up by a pretty wife, while alternatively, a blinded soldier would not mind about his wife's attractiveness, but might appreciate a good cook. The remains. In 1917, a tiny article in an American newspaper reported that Pope Benedict was completely horrified to learn that the Germans were processing the remains of dead soldiers for use in soap and fertilizer. This was one of the many stories to circulate showing that fake news is certainly not a new phenomenon. Such outright lies published as news seemed rife as assumed government-sponsored propaganda during World War I. The alleged German factory was one of the massive published lies that persisted in the media, and each news story about these horrific factories became progressively worse. According to the heinous rumours, German workers would strip the bodies of the deceased men and bundle them into threes bound with wire. These bodies were then packed into trains and transported to an industrial-scale charnel house where the fats were extracted from them for margarine and soap. The remaining meat and bones were then supposedly converted into feed for farm animals and processed to produce fertilizer. Propaganda was, of course, completely untrue. The Germans were collecting the carcasses, but of horses who had perished, loading them onto trains and transporting them to the factories. But these measures definitely did not apply to soldiers.